Well, let's get started. I hope you guys are ready for something very different from what you've probably heard a lot of talk about today. So today's talk, like I said, is going to be quite a bit different from everything else. So generally, the talks here at CS2 focus on compliance, right? Compliance strategies, mechanisms for obtaining compliance, getting and maintaining your compliance program, point solutions to get you compliant with a specific control. We're going to take a completely different approach, and that's going to focus on cybersecurity, specifically on the tactics, techniques, and procedures that hackers are using to compromise your environment today, and specifically how those tactics, techniques, and procedures tie back to the CMMC requirements. So why don't we just dive right in? To do that, we're going to be performing, or simulating rather, a penetration test against an organization in the defense industrial base. Let's pretend that that's your organization, right? And we're going to make one assumption for this talk, and we'll talk more about that assumption a little bit and how we can fill some of the gaps that are going to arise because of that assumption. But this talk is going to focus on an organization that has a hybrid environment, meaning we have local infrastructure, a local area network, potentially local Active Directory, things like that, as well as a cloud environment hosted in Azure Government, both of which are in scope for your CMMC implementation and assessment. So that means we're going to start locally. We're going to start by getting initial access to your local area network. This time, we're not going to take a hyper-technical approach to how we do that. We're going to be doing that via physical access abuse. And then we're going to have to get an initial set of credentials. We're going to do that by abusing IPv6. That's going to be probably the most technical portion of this talk, but I think it's really important for everybody to understand. Then we're going to skip ahead a little bit because I have two environments to compromise here, and we got to move quickly. So we're going to move right into pivoting at that point. I'm going to pivot from your local area network into Azure Government. Once I'm inside of Azure Government, we're going to perform enumeration and escalate our privileges by abusing dynamic groups. And then finally, I'm going to show you the way that we most commonly identify the paths between what we have compromised in Azure Government and global administrator permissions. So that's the ultimate goal. By the end of this talk, I will have domain administrator privileges locally and global administrator privileges in your cloud environment. And before we demonstrate how that works, we have to understand a couple key concepts here. So you're on the technical track. My assumption is that we have some technical people in the room. I really hope so. If you find that you're in the wrong room, I totally understand. But we have to understand a couple of key terms, right? What is a vulnerability? A vulnerability is a weakness. That weakness could exist in a piece of hardware, software, operating system, something you've installed on a piece of hardware. It could exist in a user. Those vulnerabilities could be there from a technical perspective, right? A bug or a glitch, something that needs to be updated or patched. More often than not, from our penetration testing experience, and you're going to see this throughout the entire talk here, is that we're exploiting vulnerabilities that arise because of misconfigurations or simply a lack of configuration in some cases. When an attacker or an ethical hacker, a penetration testing team, takes advantage of those vulnerabilities, we're exploiting those vulnerabilities. And when an organization works with a third party to identify and exploit those vulnerabilities and put an attack chain together that ultimately gets them, whatever the goal of that test is, generally elevated permissions, access to data, things like that, we're performing a penetration test, also known as an ethical hacking exercise. Now, I wanted to make a note right up front here, and Jacob alluded to this, that this is the third time that I've come out to do a talk like this, right? And we're going to be tying vulnerabilities and misconfigurations, the types of things that our team finds and uses on our penetration tests all the time. This time, we're going to be focusing on a hybrid cloud environment. The first time we did this talk was in Tampa. That focused specifically on local area networks, local Active Directory, even peripheral, like printers and things like that, right? The way that those types of devices and misconfigurations on a local area network can be abused by an attacker, and how a security-focused implementation of CMMC requirements can help prevent those types of things, contrasted with a compliance-focused implementation of CMMC requirements. So if you don't have a cloud environment, if some of this stuff might not be directly applicable to you, you can go back to the Tampa talk and learn all about the way that we're compromising local area networks. Similarly, last time, Huntsville, purely focused on Azure Government, Azure Active Directory. This time around, we're going to squish both of those together, and we're going to demonstrate how we compromise cloud environments. But why, right? Well, like I said, we're going to actually be taking a model DIB organization. Maybe they're a super compliant DIB organization. You have a SPRS score of 110. Maybe you even passed your joint surveillance assessment. That means that you're doing things right from a compliance perspective, right? Somebody else came in and looked at it and said, yeah, you checked those boxes and you've done a lot, and your compliance program is excellent. And the problem is, when you come in on Monday morning, you've still been compromised. Your files are still encrypted. You still got ransomware. So something happened, right? What went wrong? Well, I can tell you, in our experience, precisely what has gone wrong, and that's because we've spent a lot of time on both sides of the table. Our team has spent significant time with organizations in the DIB, helping to build and implement security and compliance programs based on NIST 800-171 CMMC requirements. And then, on the other side of the table, actively burning those programs down as ethical hackers. So that gives us a very unique perspective on how organizations are addressing some of these requirements. Now, what's the difference between a compliance-focused implementation and a security-focused implementation of the control? The control doesn't change. Your implementation is what changes. A security-focused implementation is one that will actually provide friction or resistance to the tactics, techniques, and procedures that I'm going to demonstrate here. So that's exactly what we're going to do. We're going to look at the top 5 things that our team is going to do in that hybrid cloud environment to gain initial access, elevate privileges, pivot, and elevate privileges again in the cloud environment. And then we're going to look at examples of implementations that we see in real life. We're going to look at a compliance-focused implementation, which is what we're going to assume that this organization has done. And then we're going to look at a security-focused implementation of that same control that could have prevented that attack tactic from actually working. So let's get started. Usually, these talks are hyper-technical, start to finish, right? Every tactic, technique, and procedure, every TTP that we're going to demonstrate here is almost always technical in nature. And we've had a lot of success recently with something a lot more touchy-feely and squishy, and that is gaining physical access to organizations' operating environments as a component of the penetration test. So we find very often, from a CMMC compliance perspective, or more broadly, a cybersecurity perspective, that physical social engineering is an often overlooked component of that program. It's really easy to identify, in some cases, right, and delete that phishing email, right, or to ignore the text message that you got that's clearly a phishing text message. It's a lot harder when somebody's standing right in front of you with a reasonable backstory insisting that they need access to your operating environment for whatever reason it happens to be. So why would I spend all sorts of time and resources developing a phishing campaign, setting up the infrastructure, sending the emails, crossing my fingers, hoping that somebody's going to click that link or download the attachment, when you have a very nice receptionist and you post enough information on LinkedIn about your company or on your website about the people that you work with and the business that you're doing and things like that to allow our team to craft a really, really valuable, or believable rather, narrative around why we should be inside of your building. So this is an example right here of a key card that, or rather an ID badge that we created for the last assessment. And we changed the name here to protect the innocent, but we're having a lot of success in getting initial access to organizations by leveraging physical social engineering. Like I said, it's a lot harder to resist social engineering when somebody's standing right in front of you. So you need to be wary of Sean Olson, who's sitting here right in the crowd, because he's our physical social engineer. Oh, yeah. And then, sorry, the alternatively, it looks right here. Which one are you on? Okay, that's not advancing, but this is. Is the slide changing at all? Yeah. Never fails. Is it changing now? All right.
That's why we have jobs. Never works.
All right, let's see here. That's not right. I swear I actually have a presentation.
Just notice that there is no internet.
I was using this.
Yeah, you have to use that.
Is it playing up there? Can you see?
No, because this isn't connected.
Oh, right.
What's it doing?
This one.
Copy.
All right, so we talked about physical access abuse. Hopefully, the slides are going to advance now. And it's not in presenter mode. Anyways, all right, let me get my stuff together here. Okay. Why would we ever send phishing emails when you have a nice receptionist, right? Sean's inside your environment now because he has a fake ID badge and a really, really valuable or believable narrative for why he's supposed to be there. Alternatively, what if all of your employees are wearing their badges when they leave on Friday, and they all go down to the local watering hole, and they can see, and we can see that they're wearing their badges there. Well, another person on our team who's also in the audience carries a flipper with him all the time, always ready to copy key cards. So this is a really valuable way for us to get in and to get initial access to a local area network. And it's non-technical in nature, right? There's absolutely no technical aspect to it except maybe copying that key card. So let's look at a couple controls. A couple of controls that if you implemented them in a certain way would have helped you to prevent Sean or Scott from getting access to your environment. And you would be forgiven for assuming that these controls were going to be from the PE domain, physical security, right? If you remember, this is a model DIB organization. Somebody already looked at those PE controls and said, yeah, you're doing those things. I believe that I've implemented those things. So the problem probably wasn't with your PE controls, right? Your problem lies elsewhere in the framework. We have to look somewhere else. Awareness and training. If physical security is not a component of your security awareness training program, especially for the folks who are on the front line of physical security, right? If that's reception, it would have to be the receptionist, right? Then you have taken a compliance-focused approach to this specific control. Similarly, and this is one of the most, in my opinion, misunderstood controls in the framework, is that we should be monitoring security controls on an ongoing basis. We've seen so many organizations attempt to address this control by pointing to fancy technology solutions, things like your antivirus, your EDR, your IPS, and things like that, your SIEM, and they're saying that we are consistently monitoring our systems. It has nothing to do with monitoring of the security controls. If you had taken a security-focused approach to this continuous monitoring requirement, you might have tasks that are tied to control requirements from the PE domain that say, periodically, I should probably go check my visitor records and make sure that that person who came in was expected and maybe they were escorted. I should maybe be checking my physical access logs to see that when John Smith badged in, was he actually even in the building, right? Or maybe somebody copied his key card. So that's another mechanism. And sometimes continuous monitoring is the only mechanism to identify when things aren't working properly. That's why this control is part of the framework. So let's look at examples of two different control implementations. A compliance-focused implementation would be pointing back to PE and saying, well, that column in my tracking spreadsheet or in my GRC tool, whatever it happens to be, says I've implemented PE, so I am good to go. Well, we've demonstrated that that's not enough, right? Because we got access to your physical facility, and the problem with that is that if one of the guys on my team has access to your facility, that means our team is going to get access to your network. A security-focused approach to this would be, again, a little touchy-feely, and something that a lot of organizations really should be striving for is building that culture of security, and that includes physical security. So in this case, the receptionist is more than aware that she is the gatekeeper, or he, rather, is the gatekeeper from a physical security perspective, because if we get into your operating environment, it's just a matter of time until we're on that network. So this is where we're at right now. Maybe we found an Ethernet port that was in the waiting room that was open. Maybe we were able to plug something in line with another machine. Maybe we had access to an unlocked or even a locked machine for 10 or 15 seconds, because that's all it takes. We have a presence on your network now. Our team has a presence on your network, so we've gained initial access. The next thing we need to do is get our first set of credentials. Right now, I only have access to your network. I can see some systems, right, and things like that, but I can't actually authenticate to them. I can't actually query Active Directory, whatever it happens to be. So we need a first set of credentials. And the way that we're going to do that, I presented one other mechanism for this that's very, very common, and it's these are kind of the first two things that we always do. If you're curious about other ways we can do this, I would encourage you to go look back at Tampa. This time we're going to talk about IPv6. I said this was going to be probably the most technical part of the talk. The problem is that IPv6 is enabled by default on Windows operating systems. And that's not, the crux of the problem is not that it's just enabled by default. A lot of stuff is enabled by default on Windows operating systems, and a lot of that stuff can be abused by attackers. The problem is that IPv6 is preferred over IPv4. Now that's going to come into play in a couple minutes, but I will show you right now what's probably happening on most of your internal networks where IPv6 isn't actually in use, right? I don't know if I've ever come across an organization that has implemented IPv6 internally. We have NAT now. We don't need that huge address space of IPv6. So almost no one's using IPv6 internally, but it is enabled. This is what's happening. We have a bunch of workstations, servers, laptops, whatever it happens to be. Every single one of those devices on your internal network is trying to get an IPv6 address. They are making DHCP broadcast requests. They're asking every other device on the network, do you know where the DHCP server is? Can you please assign me an IPv6 address? I'd really like to have an IPv6 address. But the problem is, you don't have one on your internal network. Those requests go unanswered. But I'm on your network, so I can be the DHCP server. So what I'm going to do is listen for those requests, because they're broadcast. That means they go to most machines on the network or any machines in the broadcast domain. I can hear those requests, and I respond to them. And I assign your system an IPv6 address. If I can assign your system an IP address via DHCP, I can also configure its DNS settings, right? I can tell that system when I do that, when I respond to that DHCP request, I am the DNS server. And because Windows prefers IPv6, the DNS server that I provide in that DHCP response becomes your primary DNS server. And that means all of your requests start with a DNS request, they're going to go to me. And it shouldn't be any surprise necessarily that if I can control DNS resolution on your network, I can control how web traffic is handled, I can control how file shares are accessed. Anytime a system wants to reach out to a file share, I can say, I'm that file share, connect to me. And it's going to try to authenticate to me. If it's trying to get out to the internet, I can say, I'm that website, connect to me first. And all that means at the end of the day is I can control how traffic is routed on your network, or how traffic flows rather. And at the end of the day, there's various mechanisms, lots of different mechanisms by which I can force a system to authenticate to me and spit out credentials. So those credentials are going to be coming right to me with no user interaction at all. This is completely blind to the end user. And I can do a couple things. Those are encrypted credentials, or hashed rather. I can try to crack them offline, which we have success at, which is no surprise. Separately, or rather concurrently, we can also relay those hashes to other systems on the network. When they come in, something tries to connect to me, I can spit it right back out to other systems on the network and pray that I can authenticate using those credentials without knowing what they are to other systems on the network. This is how we get our initial set of credentials a lot of the time, right? So let's look at a couple controls that would have addressed this specific problem. And again, we're still on your local area network here. The first one should come as no surprise. We need to restrict, disable, prevent ports, non-essential, programs, functions, ports, protocols, and services. IPv6, you're not using IPv6. It's enabled by default. It's a non-essential protocol. It should have been disabled. That one kind of speaks for itself. The second one here, I bring it up because it provides a completely separate mechanism at another layer in your network to address this specific problem or this specific threat. We need to establish and enforce security configuration settings on technology products employed in your systems. The majority of organizations that we've worked with are going to pick their primary platforms, right? Pick their primary platforms, and they're going to implement that requirement on their Windows servers and their Windows endpoints and maybe their firewall and things like that. But if you had implemented this control everywhere on any system that transmits CUI, maybe your switches, you would have had another opportunity to block this tactic right here. So a compliance-focused implementation would be a computer build procedure, right? This is what a compliance-focused approach to those two controls just look like. We have a procedure for building endpoints, building servers, whatever it happens to be. The fourth line right there says, yeah, whoever's building this machine needs to uninstall unnecessary software, right? And system components that they don't need and stuff like that. So we're behind one. Now, again, on the fourth line, we have unnecessary software and components are supposed to be removed. We're not telling that technician what's supposed to be removed. We're leaving it up to them. But maybe this passes muster from a compliance perspective. Now, from a security-focused perspective, what does a security-focused implementation look like? Make sure we're behind one now. All right. A security-focused implementation looks like, well, I've already told you, we should disable IPv6, right? IPv6 is a threat. It can be abused without any user interaction to obtain user credentials. So at the end of the day, it should be no surprise that we're adhering to the control requirement to disable non-essential protocols if we're getting rid of IPv6. Alternatively, for that second control where we're implementing security configuration settings, if you had implemented, kind of broadened where that control is implemented, and thought about the other platforms in your environment, some of the overlooked platforms like your core switching and things like that, the majority of enterprise switches are going to provide you with the capability to address this specific risk with a configuration option called DHCP snooping, which is going to tell those switches that there is one, or a small group rather, of DHCP servers on your network. Those are the only authorized DHCP servers. Anything else that's spitting out DHCP responses is going to be blocked, or they're going to drop those packets, right? So that's two different ways. You can turn off IPv6 on the endpoint entirely and mitigate this issue, or if you had implemented and actually reviewed your security configuration options at the switch level, you would have noted that there are options there too to address the specific requirement. So at this point, we have obtained at least an initial set of credentials on your internal network. We're going to have to skip ahead a little bit here because there are, well, we have an entire separate environment to compromise. But I want to note that there's a lot of different ways that even this specific single tactic can be leveraged to get even additional privileges, right? We can run this tool, we can execute this procedure throughout the entirety of our penetration test. And if I happen to target an administrator's machine, at the end of the day, that might serve as just a single mechanism for me to obtain administrative privileges in your environment, just like that, by targeting specific machines in the network. So what we're going to see here is that we're already an administrator now, right? We skipped a couple steps, potentially. Sometimes we don't have to skip steps like this. Maybe IPv6 is all we need to get administrator access. Sometimes it's not. Maybe if it wasn't IPv6, it could have been, a weak Active Directory configuration. It could have been password reuse. It could have been exploitation of Kerberos and things like that. All these things we've covered at the talk in CS2 Tampa. But at the end of the day, we need to really consider how valuable a single compromised user account can be for an attacker or a penetration testing team. As soon as we get an initial set of credentials, the number of attack chains that become available to us explodes, right? We can query Active Directory, we can start authenticating the systems, we can start moving around the network and things like that. So a single compromised credential is incredibly powerful. That means that we have technically, gained administrative privileges over your internal network. So what are we going to do next? It's time to pivot. We're going to, and in order to pivot in this specific case, again, we have a hybrid cloud environment, right? We're going to identify the system that's running AD Connect, the system that is responsible for running the service that synchronizes password hashes from your local Active Directory up to Azure Active Directory. And once we identify that system, we're going to use some PowerShell tools to extract plain text credentials for the account that exists in Azure Active Directory up in the cloud that is responsible for managing that process, right? Synchronizing password hashes and account details and things like that. In order to do that, like I said, we have to drop some PowerShell scripts. We have to be able to execute those PowerShell scripts. And what we're going to get back is the plain text username and password of the local Active Directory account that was used to configure AD Connect, plain text, more credentials for the local network. And we're also going to get, which is what I'm after, the credentials for the cloud synchronization account. So that's a cloud-born account that exists up in Azure Active Directory rather, in plain text. So we're going to get plain text credentials. A couple things to remember here is that, we have a requirement to store and transmit cryptographically protected credentials, right? Now, something that I want to get out there right now is that this is not a material, non-compliant item just because I'm able to extract plain text credentials. And there's a lot of ways to get to plain text credentials on Windows operating systems. The problem generally is that encrypted material is stored right next to the encryption key or the keying material that's used to encrypt it. If I have administrator access to that server, in this case the Active Directory Connect server, I can just simply decrypt those credentials, right? When I am authenticating using those credentials up to GCC High or up to Azure Government, they are encrypted. When they were stored on disk on that server before I pulled them out, they were encrypted. But I think we all need to remember that there really are a number of mechanisms for us to get plain text credentials off of Windows operating systems, whether they're stored on disk or whether they're stored in memory. There's a lot of different ways, and the problem lies in the fact that if you have administrative access to that system, you have all the information you need to decrypt those credentials in the first place. So the second one here is the one that I'm going to zoom in on, and that is a very interesting control from the framework for me specifically because I find it to be the only one where NIST chose to give us two different mechanisms for implementing a control. There's an OR in here that provides you two materially different ways, both of which are compliant, of implementing a control requirement. There's no other control in the framework that I'm aware of that gives you two different options like that, right? We can do a block list or we can do a safe list. The organizations that I work with, what's easier to do? Write down a list of software that's not allowed to execute, or deny everything and only allow authorized software to execute. One of those is a lot harder than the other one, and that's going to drive the way most organizations implement these controls. So what does a compliance-focused implementation look like? Well, in this case, we're looking at an example of an organization that chose to implement a block list, right? That's the easy way, the compliance-focused way. This is an example using Microsoft App Locker, where there's a list. I have an authoritative list of software that's not allowed to execute in my environment. They're not allowed to run TeamViewer, and they're not allowed to run World of Warcraft and Napster and Slack and all these other things. That's the list. And, what's non-compliant about that list? I have a list of software that's not allowed to execute. So that meets the requirement. What's the security-focused approach? Is to just do the other one. Just do the safe listing approach. And I know that's onerous and it can be difficult. There's a couple examples of dedicated software platforms that can help with safe listing and things like that. At the very bottom, I give you kind of the halfway approach, which is setting PowerShell execution policies via GPO. If you're setting PowerShell execution policies via GPO at the machine or the user scope, it doesn't matter how much access I have to a given system. Right? I can't change those things unless I'm modifying GPO. If I have domain administrator access, sure, I could go modify GPO. That's going to take me longer. It's going to make a lot more noise. There's going to be a lot more signals that you can identify that I'm doing something bad on your network. But in this case, if I only had access to AD Connect, that was the one server I had, and I wasn't able to change to bypass the PowerShell execution policy, I wouldn't have been able to execute my PowerShell scripts in the first place. So that's kind of the halfway approach. And for what it's worth, Microsoft App Locker can get you really far on the safe listing side too. Nothing wrong with that tool, but safe listing certainly can be onerous. But it is the security-focused approach. You have two options. One of them's a pencil whip, and one of them's security-focused that's actually going to prevent me from running whatever I want on that system. Well, that's clearly the security-focused approach. So now I have access to plain text credentials for the Cloud Sync account that exists in Azure Active Directory. Now, a couple things to know about that account specifically. In general, and I'd be happy to hear from somebody else in the community who knows better about this than I do, but MFA is not enabled on that account, ever. Conditional access policies do not apply to that account, ever. I have not come across guidance from Microsoft on how to implement MFA or how to implement conditional access on the Cloud Sync account because it needs to run synchronization, and there's a number of problems associated with putting something in front of that synchronization service. I don't totally understand the whole process, but every time I've compromised one, it allows me to log in from wherever I want without MFA. Now I have access to Azure Government, so we've pivoted into the cloud. One thing to keep in mind, again, is that this account, we know what this account does. I said it before. This account handles password synchronization, password hash synchronization, and user account detail synchronization between Azure Active Directory and local Active Directory. That means that this account can be abused, access to this account natively can be abused to do things like change a global administrator's password while simultaneously locking them out, right? We don't do that on our penetration tests. We're not here to cause kind of operational problems and stuff like that. And I also don't want to stop there during this presentation, so we're going to call that one too easy. What we're going to do instead is we're going to perform some additional enumeration in this environment. We're going to find dynamic groups, and we'll talk about what those are and why they can be, rather how they can be abused. So we're going to hunt for privileged dynamic groups with weak rules. And then we're going to add a guest account that meets that rule and assume those privileges. So this is how this is going to work. I have access to the cloud synchronization account. That means I can read Azure Active Directory. I can pull down a list of all your groups. I will find the ones that have a membership type of dynamic. What does that mean? That means that membership to that group is not controlled by an individual human being going in there and clicking add member or putting this person into that group. A dynamic group, membership to a dynamic group is based on a rule. If the user account details, whatever is configured in that rule, matches the requirement, they're going to get put in that group. If they get put in the group, they assume the permissions of whatever that group is provided. So in this example right here, way down at the bottom, you'll see that, actually on the left-hand side, or the right-hand side rather, I found one group inside of your tenant. It's called VM admins. My assumption is that's virtual machine admins. That means that I might get some additional access, whether it's to actually logging into individual virtual machines. Maybe I can manage the configuration of the virtual machines themselves or the kind of the control plane inside of Azure. Either way, those are permissions that I don't have right now. The cloud-born synchronization account, that's really focused on the directory, Azure Active Directory. So I can read and modify attributes in Azure Active Directory, but I don't necessarily have all the access that I need or want to the infrastructure as a service or platform as a service layers inside of Azure. So I found one group. It's called VM admins. It's a dynamic group. Open that up. It has a rule. If you look at the rule, it says user.email or user.mail equals or matches VM admins. So it's taking a string. It's saying if the email address associated with this account contains the string VM admin, then you're going to get put in that group. That's how a dynamic group works. The problem is, if anybody in your tenant, even administrators in some cases, can add guest users can invite guest users, right, via SharePoint invites or whatever it happens to be, I can invite myself to your tenant. I can create, a user inside of my tenant, a tenant that we own and manage, and I can make it match that rule. It would be Scott Goodwin _VM admin at pkfod.com or something like that. And I would invite myself into your tenant. Maybe I got, invited to a SharePoint site. As soon as I get invited and accept that invitation, which, I invited myself, this rule is going to apply to me. And I can assume, I will be put into that group dynamically, and I will assume the permissions associated with the VM admins group. So at that point, I have obtained additional permissions that I didn't have before, simply by abusing guest access. So let's look at a couple controls that, if you had implemented them from a security-focused perspective, could have helped you eliminate this attack tactic. So the first thing that we're going to look at is to limit system access to the types of functions and transactions that authorized users are allowed to execute, rather. The problem here is twofold. One, now that you know that this is a risk, that's kind of that dynamic group membership and things like that, combined with guest access being enabled, should anybody in your tenant be allowed to invite guests, to SharePoint sites or Microsoft Teams or things like that? Is invitation of an external user an authorized activity that somebody should be able to execute? And secondly, if this does work inside of your tenant, if these things are configured this way, then we have a material problem in that guest accounts can assume permission. Guest accounts are not authorized to execute any functions or transactions inside of your tenant, right? But I've shown you a mechanism by which those accounts can assume permissions by abusing dynamic groups. The second one here is the one we're going to zoom in on, which is change control from a security impact analysis specifically. Now, a lot of the organizations that we've worked with are going to pick a subset of changes that are security relevant, right? That have to be configuration controlled. So it remains to be seen if the creation of that group, the VM admins group, even went through change control in the first place for that organization, right? Because I guess it depends on who you ask whether creation of a group, just full stop, just creating a group inside of Azure Active Directory, is that a security relevant change? I think that depends on who you ask. Adding people to groups, potentially, sure, that makes sense. But there are situations where maybe no one even looked at this change. But let's assume that they did, and we'll look at a couple control implementations. So the first one we're going to look at is a compliance-focused approach. This is what we would call pencil whipping change control. If we look at why somebody wanted to make this change, it was because they wanted to ease Azure Virtual Machine Administration by using native Microsoft tools and technologies to help them make it easier. They're going to create dedicated accounts for their virtual machine admins. That's great. That actually helps you kind of meet a control requirement in and of itself. And if they're going to put, Joe Smith _ VM admin, by default, all those VM admin accounts are going to get added to the VM admins group and things like that. And then if we look at the very second to last row, rather, we see a little checkbox for security impact analysis. That's my favorite thing, is that we have a checkbox. Like, I demonstrated, like prove that I didn't do a security impact analysis. I have an X in that box. But what did that security impact analysis actually include? Nobody looked at the rule. If they did look at the rule, they didn't know what they were looking at because maybe they weren't familiar with how dynamic groups work. Is there any difference between a dynamic group and an assigned group when it comes to change control? I doubt it, right? And you'd be forgiven for doing it that way. But what we need to understand is that these new technologies, these cloud-focused technologies, they come with their own inherent risks. So my recommendation would be, first, purely from a recommendation perspective, is that privilege groups are assigned membership groups. That means an individual human being needs to actually look and say, yeah, that person belongs in that group because that group has elevated permissions. Now, alternatively, we learned previously that this change went into place. They created that group to leverage native tools and kind of features inside of Azure Active Directory to make the sysadmin's life easier. On the other hand, Microsoft is also providing tools to make it more secure, right? That's why we have privileged identity management. A much more robust way of managing privileged access would be you don't get privileged access unless you request it, it gets approved, and it's time-bound. Privileged identity management can do that to you. It doesn't matter if you're a member of the break glass admins group or the PIM admins group or whatever it happens to be. You don't have those privileges all the time. You only get them after somebody explicitly approves that request, and you only get it for an hour or 8 hours or whatever you really need it for. So these are examples of using Microsoft's own native tools, the same way that we're using those same tools to make our lives easier. Those tools can make our tenants more secure as long as we're actually using them. So at this point, I now have access to, well, I'm a domain administrator locally. That didn't take very long, and in general, it doesn't, unfortunately. We have some level of access to Azure Active Directory. We can read and kind of modify certain attributes in Azure Active Directory. So the directory layer is something that we can read, and we see all the information that's there. And now that we've done this, I also have access to the infrastructure as a service layer. So that's all the information that I need to identify additional attack paths. So at this point, I don't have global administrator yet. Sure, I can read your Azure Active Directory. I might be able to log into some virtual machines. That's a lot of access, and I can leverage that access in a lot of different ways. But I'll tell you what we really do and what attackers really do. That's leverage the permissions that they have right now to identify ways to get to their finish line as fast as possible. So what we're going to look at here is a tool called Azure Hound. You might have heard of a tool called Bloodhound. That's a very, very powerful tool developed by the guys over at SpectreOps, and that's been around for quite a long time. And what it does is you feed it directory information from, in this case, local Active Directory, and it's going to take all the objects in local Active Directory and the relationships between them, and it's going to map it all out. Similarly, that tool has been extended to account for Azure. So now there's a lot more objects available in Azure. We have things like not just users and groups, we have roles. We have virtual machines, we have storage accounts, we have app registrations, we have service principals, we have automation accounts, we have key vaults, we have blob storage, we have all these different things. Each one of those things is an object, and all of those objects are related. So what we're looking at here are some objects. You don't have to be able to see what's on that map right there, but this is kind of how it works in real life when we're doing these types of assessments. Even the bigger the organization, the more valuable this tool becomes. So we have a grouping of objects here. Say we could have thousands of objects in Azure Active Directory. The next thing we're going to do is identify all the permissions that those objects have. Not just user permissions, right, but virtual machine permissions, storage account permissions, app registration permissions, all these different things. And a tool like Azure Hound is going to let us map out the quickest way to go from the permissions that we have today. Maybe I own a virtual machine. Maybe I have compromised this account or that account. And it's going to allow us to map out specifically how to get from where we are to where we want to be. And where I want to be as global administrator. So a tool like this is in the largest, even most complex enterprise environments is going to make it relatively easy for us to identify that the VM that I control has permissions to read a key vault. That key vault has secrets in it that would allow me to take ownership of an application. That application has permissions to add members to a group. That group has the owner permissions over another group. And if I can add myself to that final group right there, I can assume global administrator permissions. So that's 5 or 6 different hops between various different disparate resources and services inside of Azure Government that are connected by these edges, and those edges represent relationships. Those relationships are based on permissions. So let's look at a couple controls that can help you to identify and block this attack tactic right here. Again, I didn't show you a very specific way of going about this. The problem is, and every time we do one of these assessments, we identify a different attack path to go from whatever we've compromised to whatever it is that we want. The first one here is to employ the privilege of least privilege. The reason I bring up this control is that the legacy, or maybe the compliance-focused implementation of this control, really focuses on user account permissions. Right? Users are the ones who have permissions. I mean, that's true, but we've just demonstrated that I can abuse permissions that are assigned to key vaults and service principals and storage accounts and automation accounts and all these different things. All of that plays in to building a path between where I am and global administrator. So least privilege applies to objects in local Active Directory as well, but specifically throughout all of Azure Active Directory. The permissions that individual services and virtual machines and things like that, those permissions can be very valuable and can be abused to hop from one service to another until we get whatever it is that we happen to be after. The second one is the one we're going to zoom in on here. It's scanning for vulnerabilities. This is the vulnerability scanning control. It says we have to scan for vulnerabilities periodically and when new vulnerabilities are discovered. The problem there is when we think about this requirement, it comes down to running a vulnerability scanning tool, right? So let's look at a compliance-focused implementation of that, control. It doesn't look bad. The compliance-focused implementation is using a vulnerability scanner to meet that requirement. That is completely fair. There's nothing wrong with tools like Nessus and Qualys and all those other tools. We need to understand what they do and what they don't do. Right? And we need to understand the risks that we're still exposed to after we have a really good-looking vulnerability scan report. When I ran Azure Hound against your Azure Active Directory tenant, or your Azure subscription rather, I was running a scan. Right? That's another type of scan. It identifies a completely different subset of vulnerabilities. So the security-focused approach, and this really applies throughout the entirety of this talk here, is that we need to do something with what we've learned. The security-focused approach is to take these risks, these threats that we've identified throughout this talk, and do something about them. The example here is putting them on your risk assessment, right? Maybe they do apply to you, maybe they don't, maybe it's not as risky as I'm making it out to be for this model organization. But at the end of the day, if we're not addressing these requirements, we're not addressing risk. So how do we conclude this, right? At this point, I've gained global administrator privileges. I've gained domain administrator privileges. The conclusions that I'd like to cover is that you're spending time and money on your compliance program right now already. Oh. Why is this such a problem? you're spending time and money in your compliance program already, right? If you're focused solely on compliance, you're not addressing real threats. That means you're wasting your resources, right? Because hackers don't care about your SPRS score. They don't care about your joint surveillance assessment. At the end of the day, if you're not addressing the threats that we're covering here or the threats that are emerging every single day, then your compliance program is not going to protect you against, well, ransomware attacks was the example we gave. We should go back all the way to the DFARS rule and remember that the first thing that pops up is that we need to implement adequate security, not just demonstrate compliance. And the most effective programs that we've seen are the ones that actually merge security and compliance together. If you have two different teams that are doing those things, if your security team is going to go turn off IPv6, they're enhancing your implementation of the configuration management controls. If you don't know about that, then you can't document it. You won't get credit for it from a compliance perspective, and vice versa. The compliance team documenting what the security team is doing and how we're implementing our requirements, right, and managing those artifacts and things like that, that's going to enhance your security program. So what are our next steps? Is that right? Good. We need to start thinking about your architecture, whatever it is that you're trying to protect, against the 5 things that we talked about here. If what I covered is either not directly applicable or pieces of it aren't, maybe you don't have a cloud environment, maybe you don't have a local Active Directory environment, whatever it happens to be, we've provided coverage for those other types of environments verbosely in other talks, right? Tampa and Huntsville. We need to do something with what we've learned here today. You might want to consider this, I would, a security advisory. If you consider it a security advisory, then you're obliged to do something about it because the control tells you you have to. You have to monitor and respond to security advisories. And if you're an organization that thinks that you've checked all the boxes, whether that's from a compliance perspective or you think that you've actually done it from a security perspective, you'll find absolutely no better value than performing a penetration test to either validate those things or help you identify and close additional gaps. So that's the end of this one. I think it's time for questions. I have a couple minutes left here. Does anybody have any questions they'd like to cover? Oh yeah, I forgot.
Hello.
Hello.
Boriana Borisova with BDO Public Sector. Thank you for the talk. So you pointed out some really great Achilles heels with the configurations that you exploited, from the fact that you could have guest accounts and the fact that there were some user-controlled attributes as part of how the dynamic groups were built. Is there any merit in maybe implementing also a naming policy for the groups themselves so they aren't so obvious, like codifying them a little bit? Or do you think it won't help so much?
If the intent there is to rename the VM admins group so it's not obvious that that's an administrative group, is that the intent? Yeah. No. I mean, I can see the permissions that are assigned to the group, right? So I made an assumption during the talk, but no, in general, security through obscurity is not something that's going to stop our team or a real attacker, especially if they have the time to sit there and click buttons or review whatever data they've exported. At the end of the day, the permissions that are assigned to the group is something that we can enumerate directly, right, without just kind of relying on the name. So it might cost us, like, I don't know, a minute or two. So I'd go with no.
Other people had questions? Hands up? Yes? Okay.
Given the effectiveness of Azure Hound and Bloodhound for, enumerating and taking care of your identity infrastructure, why don't we see that, implemented in either like a vulnerability scanner or some other regular implementation for, a company?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I mean, I think now Tenable, has dedicated solutions for Active Directory. They have cloud scanning tools and things like that. So I think it's coming. I think these risks are being exploited in reality, right? So I think vulnerability scanning tools and vulnerability management platforms are kind of obliged, or it would benefit them to deal with some of these threats. But at the end of the day, that's just not what the tools are designed to do. Anytime that there is a vast trove of data that's valuable from a threat perspective or from an attacker's perspective, we're going to develop tools to gather it as quickly as possible and figure out how to make value out of it. I think it's kind of an example of whether it's the ethical hacking side of it or the actual threat actor side of it being one or more steps ahead of the blue team side, the IT side of it, the response side of it. So unfortunately, I find that tends to be true, that we have better or more valuable tooling from a penetration testing perspective than lots of organizations are equipped with from a response perspective.
So out of the customers that you've interacted with, and excluding IPv6 and all that stuff, how many of those customers have implemented controls on the workstation to prevent like SCT or stigging or anything like that? Has that helped, or has it basically caused you guys enough pain to go, yeah, I know there's always time associated with it, but has that helped?
The implementation of like secure baselines? Absolutely. I mean, I think, I said it before, but a takeaway should be that nothing that we covered during this talk and nothing that I covered in Tampa or Huntsville, not that you've seen those presentations, but I've done 3 of these. That's 15 different really, really technical specific things you can do to protect your network. Not a single one of them is going to come up on a vulnerability scanning tool. It's not a missing patch. It's not, it's not something that you can go apply an update and fix the problem. It's almost always related to how you configured that or how you didn't configure that endpoint, server, printer, storage account, blob, whatever it happens to be. Our team, the methodology that we execute doesn't rely on the presence of technical vulnerabilities due to missing patches at all. If they're there and they're exploitable safely, we'll do that. Thank you for leaving those there for us. But, we very, very rarely, in fact, very rarely, is the exploitation of a technical vulnerability that is, due to a missing patch or something like that, 0 day, whatever it is, very rarely is that a piece of the attack chain that we actually needed to go from wherever we started to domain admin or whatever it happens to be, what our goal is. It's almost never the case. So secure baseline configurations, if you look at CIS benchmarks, if you look at the STIG, they're going to tell you, turn off IPv6. It's there, right? So these are like standing on the shoulders of giants again. People know better than I do, and a lot of us do, about the weaknesses and default configurations of any asset. And if those are the things that are often not addressed, if you're rolling your own secure baseline strategy for your endpoints or your servers or things like that, you're overlooking the things that we're going to exploit, and almost always. Maybe not always, but CIS benchmarks, STIGs, whatever it happens to be, getting it into an environment where those GPOs are deployed, or that's part of your build process and things like that, that's a bad day for our team. It is.
Okay, we got a question in the back.
Hi. Yes, that was actually really encouraging to hear. You said that secure baselines are actually beneficial to apply. It's a lot of work, but I've implemented the STIGs selectively, sometimes, because some of them are DoD specific and some of the functionality we need. But what I've found a benefit is that when a vulnerability comes out of 0 day or something like that, they have a mitigation. Well, I've already applied that because I did the STIG, so thank you for that. That's really encouraging. It's a lot of work to maintain, but that's encouraging. Thank you.
Turning stuff off not only eliminates the need to configure whatever that was securely, but it also reduces your attack surface in general. If RDP isn't exposed, if you're not leveraging, whatever it happens to be, whatever protocol you want to talk about, if it's not there, then it doesn't matter how it was configured, right? I can't get to it. It's not there. It doesn't matter if it's insecure or not. You turned it off, right? So limiting your attack surface, if there are no port services exposed, host-based firewalls are up, I can't communicate with your systems in the first place, right? And that's a prerequisite for me getting into them.
Private sector with CyberLogic Security. Change management is, when you were talking about groups and that should be a change request, good God. So I follow this maxim with my clients, and I would say if it's a privileged account, definitely needs to go through a change request. But, depending on the size of your client, the more odious you make that and the more granular you make that, sometimes it defeats the purpose and they'll just stop doing it. So I try to find that line. Is that common, or what do you usually see there?
I think it's, to expect any change that would affect your baseline, whatever that baseline is, your system inventory, anything, there are some there are people out there who would fight for any change to a managed artifact inside of your CMMC program should go through change control, right? You're adding a system, you're removing a system, you're decommissioning that, you're installing a piece of software. I mean, that's one approach, right? But the majority of organizations we work with are trying to find that line of a security relevant change. What bubbles up to the top that could have a negative, if it was implemented wrong, or if somebody didn't approve it, whatever it happened to be, it could represent a material weakness in a system. We'll call those, like, again, security relevant changes. Those are the ones in your configuration management policy where it says those are the ones that go through change control. It's a hard line to draw, and that line moves daily, probably, and especially it moves between organizations. I guess from my perspective, our job is to identify, those services and those features, which is one of my favorite terms from Microsoft, one of those features that we can abuse. And I take away from this would be, to kind of understand the risks associated specifically with dynamic groups, right? If you create a static group, human beings control who goes into that group, but the dynamic group itself introduces anything that makes life easier, makes your kind of environment riskier. Unfortunately, we're always balancing collaboration and ease of administration with security. So it's an incredibly fine line. I wish I had a better answer, but I do find it very, very commonly that we're not trying to force everything through change control. But I don't think there's any right answer for.
People is if you're in a spot where you have something more vulnerable, if we pinpointed that as a vulnerability or something we can try to fix, build additional controls around that. So for this one, what I say is every month your IT committee gets together and they review any new groups created, new users created, and stuff like that. That gives you a little bit of oversight, so at least you have a chance to catch it on the back end.
Yep, mitigations, absolutely. I think there's, that's kind of why my example for the last tactic that we gave was just taking the stuff and not forgetting about it when we leave the room, but put it in your risk assessment, right? Like, you don't have to. Some of these things might not apply to you, and maybe you don't want to. I heard one person recently tell me Microsoft's recommendation is that they want to leave IPv6 on. It's a bad idea to disable IPv6 because potentially, Microsoft is using IPv6 for internet connections, right? They want to be able to support it up there. If you turn it off on an endpoint, it's off for local traffic, it's off for internet traffic and things like that. So maybe you don't want to do it that way. A mitigation could be, the second solution I gave, which was DHCP snooping on your switch. You can leave it on. If I can't respond to those requests, then it's moot for me. I can't respond, then the IPv6 problem has been addressed without turning off IPv6, right? So, mitigations are absolutely another opportunity.
They're revising that right now, that IPv6.
Microsoft?
Yeah. The stuff didn't work. You turn it off and things would stop working.
Christian Sosa with University of Colorado. I just wanted to ask, and hopefully this isn't too dumb of a question, but do you have any words of wisdom to analysts and security engineers to help find those vulnerabilities and threats that aren't picked up by our scanners, essentially, that are so dangerous?
That's a great question. I think it would be to do everything that you can to learn from the thought leaders and the folks who are developing tools and techniques on the other side of the table, right? So, if you're on the blue team side, right, you're protecting, you're threat hunting and things like that, the best thing you can do is run every single tool that the red teams are running on your own network. Maybe ask somebody first. But at the end of the day, like Azure Hound, you're never gonna know that one virtual machine that doesn't matter at all it doesn't have CUI on it, that's for sure. It's just sitting up there in Azure to run, who knows what. If that gets compromised, it provides right to global admin. You would never know that unless you're running a tool like Azure Hound or you spend days manually correlating all those relationships and stuff, which I don't recommend. So yeah, at the end of the day, knowing what red teams are doing is the best way to identify and develop alerts and triggers and things like that for what they're doing on your network. The alternative there being, work with one, right? Have them come in and, work closely with somebody who's going to do that stuff with you or on your behalf, and then go through the report and say, I did not know that they did this. right? All right, let's build a strategy for identifying that that's happening on my network and things like that. But yeah, we can learn a lot just by executing the stuff that the bad guys are executing, honestly.
I think that's all the time we have. Give it up for the Dark Sorcerer, Scott Goodwin, everybody.